Shalom, shalom, peace be upon you, peace be with you. Abundant blessings upon you from the Almighty, the Most High God, Maria Allah, or Lord, Master, God. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and if you are familiar with our YouTube channel, you know that we bring you the original, ancient, very old Assyrian or Aramaic Old Testament manuscripts in the long dead, original, ancient, very old language spoken by God to Adam and Eve in the garden, and supposedly by the men at the Tower of Babel. One to another, they spoke that one language, according to the scriptures. We bring you that Old Testament, Brita, Lishara Atika Sapraya, the sacred scribal language of God, translated into English, the nearest English equivalent by a native-born Aramaic-speaking translator from Mesopotamia, Syria, Victor N. Alexander. He speaks many Aramaic dialects, and he's a filmmaker, a graduate from the San Francisco Film Academy in America, and a Mesopotamian history buff. And we also bring you his downed but we revived website, va.com, and his translation into nearest English equivalent of the original ancient, very old Galilean Aramaic manuscripts, the New Testament, and his translation project and notes. So you will know the real truth, the whole truth, the complete truth about the scriptures and what they actually say in the original language, translated by Victor N. Alexander, the Aramaic translator, into the nearest English equivalent. So you never have to be baffled or confused or anything else ever again. We are here at this particular website, and this is about the Assyrian history and the Assyrian Church of the East and their history. The Assyrians, A Debt of Honour, was written by British Brigadier-General J. Browne, an eyewitness to the suffering of the Assyrians. The article, including photographs and caption, is now made available online in its entirety by Assyrian Information Management AIM, the organisation which manages Ator. The Atorai were the people of Syria, that's what they were known as. And then you have the Indian Church, obviously in India, in the east, named the Surai, and so forth. 1937, The Assyrians, A Debt of Honour, by Brigadier-General J. Browne, published in the Geographical magazine, Volume 4, Number 6, November 1936 to April 1937 edition. London, 40 to 42 Chandra Street, Strand, WC2, UK. The story of the Assyrians is not one of which the British can be proud. Had we not afforded them protection and help, their situation might, it is true, be worse than it is today. But everyone who reads General Browne's moving account must feel that here indeed is a debt of honour which it would be shameful to leave unpaid. See, these people were persuaded to join the British Army, sign up to get their land back at the end of it, but the British reneged and basically took their land, supposedly. This is as far as we know. So we'll look at this account. The story of the Assyrians is not one of which the British can be proud. Had we not afforded them protection and help, their situation might, if it is true, be worse than it is today. But everyone who reads General Browne's moving account must feel that here indeed is a debt of honour which it would be shameful to leave unpaid. No two men have done more to redress the balance than General Browne, who commanded the Assyrian levies in Iraq for 8 years and was chosen by the League of Nations to investigate the possibilities of Assyrian settlement overseas, and Captain Gracie, organising secretary of the Assyrian Settlement National Appeal. If the Assyrians of today are of the same race as the old conquering people of that name in pre-Christian history, any account of them must span a period of little less than 4,000 years, beginning as it does somewhere about 1800 BC. but they do not themselves claim this descent. It is true that they resemble the ancient Assyrians in appearance, dress, language, and personal names. Those of Sargon and Nimrod, which Victor N. Alexander apparently is a descendant of. Those of Sargon and Nimrod are very common among them, but they are content to say, "We know that we were once a great people," and to leave it at that. If they are in fact descended from the ancient race, a curious repetition of history has recently taken place. Somewhere about 1100 BC, Ashur-nazir-pal, king of Assyria, built a number of mound forts among the centre of the valley which runs eastward from Sulaymaniyah in Iraq, to keep that part of the country in order. In AD 1925, when building police posts in the same valley and for the same purpose, we found that the best places were these same mound forts, and the construction was guarded by the Assyrian troops of the Iraq levies. Whatever may be the truth about their descent, the Assyrians of today date their history from the conversion to Christianity by St. Thomas and St. Thaddeus, the disciples of Jesus, and later apostles. In about AD 70, this begins the development of what the writer here would call the missionary period, or calls the missionary period. The Assyrian, in his natural surroundings, displays a fierce and determined character, full of energy and fired by the new faith. They spread it northwards and eastwards. This brought them into conflict with the revived Persian Empire of the Sassanids, and a cruel persecution followed. Relief came from the south. In the year 633, the Arabs burst into Mesopotamia as conquerors and proselytizers, offering to all the choice of conversion, tribute, or the sword. The Assyrians chose to pay tribute, and probably because of the Persian cruelties, they joined the Arabs, and the Persian Empire went down in ruins. The Prophet Muhammad then gave the Assyrians a written firman. What is a written firman? What is a firman? Which was in existence as late as 1847, according them permission to carry out their own religious observances without interference. What is a firman? Let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at the word firman. So we fully understand that particular sentence. Firman. A firman at the constitutional level was a royal mandate or decree, so that was a law, issued by a sovereign in an Islamic state. During various periods they were collected and applied as traditional bodies of law. The word firman comes from Persian, meaning decree or order. So that's the definition of firman. The Prophet Muhammad then gave the Assyrians a written firman, which was in existence as late as 1847, according them permission to carry out their own religious observances without interference. But they were told no idols, so they changed everything to icons apparently. The Arabs, or what appeared to be idols, like crosses and all that sort of stuff, or statues. The Arabs also seem to have raised no objection to missionary work, and the Assyrians spread their faith across Asia and to China, where its influence can even yet be traced, and to India, where there is still a community of some 12,000 or 15,000 souls under a bishop on the Malabar coast. These are the Surai. Okay. Thus, the period between the 7th and 13th centuries might be called the golden age of the Assyrian church compared with its subsequent history. Then came a period of calamity, and unless we can find some real scheme or settlement for these people, the writer was afraid that we must admit that they are still in such a period to this very day. It began with the Mongol invasions, which started about 1230 and ended just after 1400. When they ceased, the population of Mesopotamia was reduced to 1/10 and the land ruined. The canal system was broken down, as the canals in many places were in a built-up bed above the surrounding country. The land was turned first into a swamp, and then, as the canals silted up, into a salt desert. From the air, the country now looks like a skeleton. The lines of what were once canals can be traced, running from the rivers into what is now desert. Mounds and rubble as intervals mark what formerly were villages. And here are some pictures from quite a few years back. And it states, today the Assyrians have no country, but before the Great War some 80,000 of them dwelt and grazed their flocks into the mountain district of Hakiari, near the present junction of the Turkish, Persian and Iraq frontiers. Today the Assyrians have no country, but before the Great War some 80,000 of them dwelt and grazed their flocks in the mountain district of Hakiari, near the present junction of Turkey, etc., etc. In most of the mountains villages, the flat-roofed stone houses of the Assyrians are now deserted. The former occupants of these, with their orphan children, are scattered in temporary settlements in Iraq or Syria, far from their highland homes. In most part of the mountain, it's really hard to read, kind of blurry. In most of the mountain villages, the flat-roofed stone houses of the Assyrians are now deserted. The former occupants of these, or their orphan children, are scattered in temporary settlements, etc., etc. The remnant of the people fled to the more inaccessible parts, the Assyrians, mainly into mountain district of Kurdistan known as Hakiari. Here in 1517 they became subjects of the Turkish Empire. And so remained until the outbreak of the Great War, when some 80,000 were established in this highland area. Others remained within the present boundaries of Iraq, in Mosul and the valley of the Tigris, numbering at the same period about 10,000. The Assyrian pre-war habitat was not, however, solely confined to Turkish territory, for yet another group of 35,000 Assyrian lowlanders dwelt on the shores of Lake Urmia in the Persian Azerbaijan. The followers of the Assyrian Patriarch thus reached a total of 125,000, excluding the community of India. This probably would have been under the Ottoman Turks. A short sketch of their method of rule may be of interest. Their head is the patriarch called the Mar Shimun, his full title being His Beatitude the Mar Shimun, Catholicos, Patriarch of the East. Under him are 3 metropolitans, whom we might call archbishops. 2 are in Iraq and 1 in India. The Mar Shimun may not marry, so that their office descends from uncle to nephew in the Mar Shimun family. Up to the last few years, the Mar Shimun was not only spiritual head, but also directed the policy of his people, acted as the representative in dealing with officials, and under certain conditions as the leader in war. There is also a system of tribal rule. The tribes fall into 2 distinct divisions, the Asheret, or free tribes, numbering 6, and the Ra'ah, or tribes subjects to Kurds, Turks or Persians, numbering 15. The tribes are ruled by a Malik, or chief, hereditary in most cases, but in some Tukuma, for instance, a Malik is elected for a term of 4 years from one of 5 families. The Asheret tribes formed a small compact enclave on both sides of the Great Azab. Kushanis, the home of the Mar Shimun, was on the north side of this enclave, close to Eula Merk, the headquarters of Wali or Turkish official in whose jurisdiction Hakiari lay. Cut off from the outside world, the Assyrians carried on such industries as were necessary for their livelihood. Certain tribes, however, specialized. For instance, the Baz tribe were expert builders in stone, and many well-built stone houses constructed by them can still be seen in Kurdish villages. An Assyrian priest, member of the Church of the East that once spread Christianity as far as China. You must have these old manuscripts there. About 170 years ago, part of the people living in the plains broke away from the patriarch and formed the Chaldean Church. Otherwise there is little to note until the year 1847, when the Wali of Mosul, frightened by the tales that reached him of the increasing strength of the Assyrians, instigated by him and helped by Turkish troops, a powerful Kurdish chief called Badir Khan Beg attacked the Assyrians. A horrible massacre followed, much destruction was done, and the firman of Muhammad was destroyed. That decree or that law was destroyed. The news reached Constantinople. Our ambassador there, Stratford Canning, reported to London, and on the representatives of our government, the massacre was stopped. For this, the Assyrians still venerate the name of Queen Victoria. They hold her in honour. In the 80s, Archbishop Benson, then Archbishop of Canterbury, formed a mission to the Assyrians, and a body clergy and laymen went out to help in educating their clergy. Already American missionaries were there, and as a result of this influence, a number of Assyrians have since immigrated to America. They went there to preach to them and convert them to Western Christianity. They tried to translate their beloved King James Version into the Syriac, but apparently there wasn't a solid Syriac grammar, so they tried to recreate one, or create one, and they botched the translation. And according to the information that we have gathered through our personal research of the Assyrians. We now come to the Great War. At first, even after Turkey came in, the Assyrians remained quiet. The author or the writer of this article was told that the Wali of Ulamerk was a good man and a friend to them, and that had he remained, they might have stayed quietly in their hills. But he was moved, and another took his place. Then the Russians, having defeated the Turks at Sari Kamish, got into touch with the Assyrians and urged them to rise against the Turks. The new Wali heard of this, decided on terrorism, and attacked the Assyrians in Abak. This determined the course the Assyrians were to pursue. As was their custom when an important decision had to be made, the Patriarch called together the Grand Council of tribal representatives to consider what attitude they should take in the Great War. The Patriarch put the question to the vote, and the vote was for war with Turkey, which was accordingly declared in May 1915. In Mosul was the younger brother of the Patriarch, Hormizd Dimar Shamun. The Wali of Mosul seized him and sent a message to the Patriarch to say that he would execute Hormizd unless the Assyrians kept quiet. The Patriarch replied that he must think of his people, and Hormizd was executed. The decision for war had only just been taken when the Russians, hard pressed in Poland, withdrew their forces and left the Assyrians to face the Turks and Kurds alone. In the summer they could hold off their enemies in their mountains, but this was impossible in the Arctic winter of Kurdistan. The Patriarch made his way through the enemy to Urmia, where the Russians, who virtually controlled northern Persia before the war, were established, interviewed and made plans with them, and returned. Courage and self-reliance have preserved the Assyrian people through the centuries against hostile neighbours. Then led the Patriarch, the whole nation broke through the enemy lines, crossed over the mountains to Urmia, and joined the Russians. 3 Assyrian battalions were formed, one led by the Marshamun himself, the other 2 being commanded by Russian officers, with Assyrian officers as interpreters. They fought alongside the Russian troops. Then came the Russian Revolution, and once again the Assyrians were left alone. Turkey was, however, assailed from several directions, and the Assyrians were able to hold on. Early in 1918, the British, who had by then extended their lines from Baghdad across Persia to the Caspian, through Kermanshah, Hamadan and Qazvin, made contact with the Assyrians. A British airman landed at Urmia and brought back news that the Assyrians needed arms and ammunition, and arrangements were made to send them a convoy. Disasters now fell on the Assyrians. They first lost their wise and brave leader, the Patriarch Benjamin Dimar Shamun. He was advised to make an agreement with a Kurdish chief, Ismail Agha of Shikak, called Simcoe, or the Little Man. This man received the Patriarch at his house and had him shot down as he left, apparently thinking he would please the Persians by so doing. It is satisfactory to know that he gained nothing by this act. The Persians repudiated him. The Turks wished to execute him. The Assyrians, to avenge the Patriarch, marched against Simcoe, seized this town and burnt it. He escaped, but lived as a hunted man for 12 years and was finally shot by Persians in 1930. Paulus Dimar Shamun, the Patriarch's brother, was elected Patriarch. Then came the second disaster. He was elected because it's a family thing, right? The Shamuns were a family. It's a family thing. By arrangement with the British, a large proportion of the fighting men had gone to meet the convoy, which was being sent to them, when the Turks suddenly attacked. The depleted line broke and the whole mass of Assyrians started on a hurried retreat to the south. Having made no arrangements, they seized food in the villages through which they passed. The villagers attacked the stragglers. Typhus and dysentery broke out. An eyewitness gives a ghastly picture of how the exhausted people dropped where they could for the night, how they struggled up in the mountain to continue the march, leaving dead, dying, and those too weak to move behind them, while the enemy swept down on the helpless people to rob and murder. Eventually they struck patrols of the 14th Hussars, who beat off the pursuers, and the Assyrians reached Hamadan. 50,000 started and 30,000 arrived. 20,000 died or disappeared. From Hamadan they were sent by lorry to Bakuba, monument in Aramaic, English in Iraq, where they were camped. Okay, the monument is in Aramaic and English. In Iraq, where they were camped until the war ended. Here, Polas de Mashamun died. The hardship of the retreat were too much for one who was already a sick man. His prospective successor and nephew, Ishai de Mashamun, a boy of 16, was elected and later went to England and studied at St. Augustine's College, Canterbury, and at Westcott House, Cambridge. The Great War ended, and an attempt was made to repatriate the Assyrians by marching them back to their own country under their own leaders. This failed. Their own organisation was bad, it was too late in the year to cross the higher mountains, and finally the route to Hakkari led through the country of Kurds who had attacked the Assyrians in 1915, and fighting broke out. They were therefore all sent to the Mosul Liwa province to wait while the victorious allies wrangled in Paris. A sequence of events now occurred which vitally affected the future of the Assyrians. As early as 1915, the British authorities in Iraq had begun to enrol a force now known as the Iraq Levies, consisting chiefly of Arabs and Kurds under British officers. In 1921, at a conference held in Cairo, it was decided that thenceforth Arabs should serve only in the Iraqi army, controlled by the Arab government, then in process of establishment under the British mandate. Iraq, until that period, had been held mainly by troops of the British and Indian armies at a cost of some £20 million a year, but it was now proposed to reduce this sum to £4 million by entrusting military responsibility to the Royal Air Force. The latter, however, insisted on the necessity of having an absolutely reliable force to back them, especially for the protection of the aerodromes. And such a force was fortunately at hand in the shape of the Iraq levies. For now that the Arabs were no longer available, soldiers had to be found elsewhere, and it was decided to enlist the Assyrians. These had already demonstrated their reliability, not only when operating our columns in Kurdistan in 1919, or their columns in 1919, but in the critical situation which developed at the time of the widespread Arab insurrection of 1920. General Sir J. Aylmer Haldane, who was then a commander in Iraq, stated that their valour saved the British forces, and Sir Arnold Wilson, the Civil Commissioner, confirmed this. Yet further confirmation of their value was afforded by the first High Commissioner under the mandate, Sir Percy Cox, who in his report on Iraq administration 1920-22 stated that they had proved their strategic value on the Iraq front tier. In March, over 2,000 enlisted in the levies within 3 weeks. It is far from improbable that this instant response on the part of a people whose qualities as fighting men are renowned was the main reason which included the Kemalists to abandon their projected attack. Led by British officers, they are second to none. Thus the Iraq levies became entirely Assyrians, and the British government are very much indebted to the Assyrians for their ability to effect a great saving of expense in Iraq from 1922 to 1932. So, what's that saying? They saved them a lot of money. But the use of the Assyrians in this way and the memory of their attitude during the Arab revolt had serious consequences for themselves, as it made them very unpopular with the Iraqi nationalists, who looked upon them as a sort of Praetorian Guard of the British, and the Assyrians did not help to improve matters by speaking of themselves as King George's troops, as opposed to the Arab army. Attempts were made to combat this with a view to the future. Assyrians were encouraged to join the Iraqi army, and about 100 did so. 6 Assyrian boys, including Theodorus de Mar, joined the police, and 2 became sub-inspectors. And here's some pictures here. of a woman washing clothes in the copper dishes that the Assyrians used indiscriminately for baking, laundry work and bathing. Note the empty petrol tins. Keys there over here. Now the universal water containers of the Near East. The lowland Assyrians, of whom some 35,000 formerly inhabited the plains near Lake Urmia in Persia, lived partly by making pottery, which they traded with the Highlanders. The Assyrian women ply their needles without ceasing. Here they are making quilts with scraps sent from an English dressmaker's floor. Adept at many handicrafts, the Assyrian women weave both cotton and wool. The former, grown by the plainsmen, is woven into native fabrics, like that worn by the woman on the left. The latter, from the mountaineer sheep, is used only for bedding and for stockings. Fashioning a flat tray from dried grass coloured with vegetable dyes, these trays serve as platters for carrying food. Set on the ground at meals, they hold the staple articles of family diet: paper-thin bread, pilav of rice, and bulgur of thrice-cooked wheat. It's cooked 3 times. In their homeland, the Assyrians were united against persecution by their religion, taught to them in their Syriac language by the village priests. What heritage awaits the homeless orphans of today? Of that era, right? But the antipathy between the Iraqi nationalists and the Assyrians, full of anxiety for their future, did not die down. During the period 1920 to 24, Assyrians had been moving back into the country in small numbers, and it looked as if they might be quietly re-established there. But in the middle of 1924, the Turkish wali of Julemirk made a tour through Hakkari, and he and his escorts had a small fight with some Tekuma Assyrians. What was that? Tekuma Assyrians, go with that. Both sides met afterwards and decided that it was a mistake, but the attention of the Turkish government was drawn to the area. A Turkish force marched into Hakkari, drove out the Assyrians and entered Iraq. They were driven back on the Hizir River by air action, and in the Sir Ahmadiyya area by a force of Iraq levies and Assyrian irregulars under their bishop Ma'u'alaha of Be'er War. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, and a boundary line between Iraq and Turkey was drawn out of a meeting of the Council of the League in Brussels. A League commission sent out to examine the situation recommended the Brussels line as the Iraq-Turkish boundary, and this recommendation, in spite of all the efforts of the British, was adopted. Such produce as the mountaineers could spare, butter, cheese and grain, was carried down on mules, from the hills probably, and donkeys and homemade sacks to market and exchanged with the plainsmen for cloth and vessels. From this decision, now admitted to be a blunder, date all the troubles in which we, Iraq and the League, are involved in today. It left the Assyrian country except a very small area within the Turkish frontier, and the Turks will not have the Assyrians back. It left over 30,000 Assyrians without homes in Iraq. It left Great Britain and Iraq with an insoluble problem. The story of the Assyrians from now on makes depressing reading, culminating in the present situation. Attempts were made to domicile them in the northern part of Iraq, and a certain number of Assyrians were settled, but generally speaking, the problem was far from solved when in 1932 the decision to give up the mandate was taken. Assyrians all along insisted that they would not be safe after the British left, scattered as they were in small parties among the Kurds. When the relinquishment of the mandate became a certainty, they took a desperate step to bring their case to notice. This was a political mutiny when officers and men of the levies declared that they wished to be disbanded in a month from June 1st, 1932. From the writer's point of view, etc., they had no right to do anything of the sort, and a most dangerous would have arisen maybe a most dangerous situation, would have arisen if several thousand men, all armed, were collected together in the area north of Mosul. No one knew what their plans were. From the Assyrian point of view, it was simply a desperate attempt to bring their case home to everyone before it was too late. Many took part unwillingly, and the more level-headed admitted they were wrong, but all decided that they must hold together. As fighting men, the Assyrians showed their qualities during the war when they fought for the Allies and later in the Iraq levies. A detachment of the levies changing guard at the British Residency. Assyrians and Kurds road making in Baghdad for the late King Faisal. After some weeks of tension, it was decided that the Mar Shamoun should go to Geneva and put the case of his people to the League in person. The levies all withdrew their resignations, and all were made to promise individually never again to take part in any more demonstrations of a political nature while serving. To their honour, they have kept this promise to the letter, as will be shown later. The efforts of the Mar Shamoun at Geneva had no result, and the mandate over Iraq was given up without the Syrian problem being solved. But a settlement officer, Major Thompson, was sent out to work under the Iraq government, and his work began in 1933. Then matters began to move rapidly to a crisis, and that was the Assyrian patriarch, the Mar Shamoun, who was educated in England, heir to the leadership of a people whose very existence was in jeopardy. Okay, so he was the head, the chief. Two ex-Levi officers, Yaqub Ismail of the Upper Tiari and Loko Shlilamun of the Tekuma, after figuring in a series of disturbing situations in the country north of Mosul, marched off into Syria with between 400 and 500 men. They were all armed, but they had no intention to fighting because they left their women and children in Iraq, a thing that they would certainly not have done had they intended to war. A delicate situation followed, involving France, Iraq and Great Britain. Then these Assyrians decided to march back, and they arrived on the Tigris near Deir Abun. Unfortunately, the Iraqi government had put a force of some 4,000 men into the area and were holding the line of the river. Had they not done this, it is conceivable that the Assyrians would have made their way back into Iraq. Feeling that they had acted foolishly and the ensuing events would never have occurred, as it was, two groups of people, both armed, both disliking each other intensely, met on the river. It was only necessary for one rifle to go off for hostilities to begin, and that is what happened. It was only necessary for one rifle to go off for hostilities to begin, and that is what happened. Who fired first will never be known. A savage little fight ensued in which the Assyrians, after some initial success, suddenly broke off and retired. There is no excuse for what followed. So far the action of Iraq had been correct. Now prisoners were shot in cold blood, and a horrible massacre of between 400 and 500 perfectly innocent unarmed men of the Baz tribe took place in Semel. The Iraqi army were entirely responsible. The civil authorities seem to have had no hand in it. Contrary to expectation, the Kurds, with very few exceptions, did nothing against the Assyrians. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we are hoping that you are enjoying this historical account of the Assyrians and their counterparts. We hope that it's making very interesting reading, hearing. This occurrence made it impossible for the Assyrians to remain in Iraq, and the matter was brought before the League of Nations. The writer stated a little further back that the levies had given their word not to take part in any political move while serving. Here was a supreme test. In Mosul was a company of levies, all Assyrians, guarding the aerodrome. It's probably the British aerodrome. One can imagine what the feelings of these men were on receiving the news from the north, only 50 miles away. Reports would have lost nothing in the telling, and in some cases, as is that of the brother of Yaqub Ismail, Daniel Ismail, by name, chief Assyrian officer of the levies in Baghdad, their close relatives were involved in the affair, but the whole lot kept their word, and not one single attempt was made to give trouble in circumstances which might have well imposed too great a strain even on the discipline of British troops. The matter was now primarily the League of Nations, the League's affair, and so it still remains while the world is being searched to find a home for these people. But the responsibility for the solution of this problem does not rest with the League alone. Great Britain herself is deeply committed both by her past actions and by the utterances of her statesmen. Speaking at the Lausanne Conference of 1922-23, Lord Curzon said, insofar as they are now settled with the borders of British influence, they, the Assyrians, are assured of our friendly interest and protection. In the House of Commons in 1931, Dr. Drummond Shields, Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, said the Assyrians were a people to whom we were under special obligations. And in 1932, Lord Parsfield, Secretary of State for the Colonies, gave assurances that after the conclusion of any treaty and after the admission, if it were brought about, of Iraq into the League of Nations, the welfare of the Assyrian people would be a matter of the closest concern of Her Majesty's government. At the time, or His Majesty's government, depends, it was a queen or a king sitting on the throne at the time. At the time when Iraq was admitted to membership of the League of Nations in 1932, the League Council had referred to the Mandates Commission certain petitions which had been received from the Assyrians and Kurds, but in view of the fact that the treaty between Britain and Iraq governing the termination of the mandate included a draft declaration containing guarantees to cover the protection of minorities, Iraq was admitted before the Mandates Commission had prepared its reports. In submitting this to the Council at a later date, the spokesman of the Mandates Commission drew attention to the British government's declaration that in recommending the admission of Iraq to the League, it regarded itself as normally responsible. He added that, had it not been for this declaration, the Commission would, for its part, have been unable to contemplate the termination of a regime which appeared some years ago to be necessary in the interests of all sections of the community. It has been suggested that this assumption of eventual moral responsibility by His Majesty's government absolved the League of Nations from moral responsibility for the result. The result in all its implications has already been described. Since the date of the Semil massacre nearly 4 years ago, many attempts have been made to arrange for the settlement of Assyrians outside Iraq. Well, this is so many years ago. The first solution suggested was the Parana plantation in Brazil. The Brazilian government turned down the project for political reasons. Then British Guiana was tried, but it proved unsuitable as an immediate solution because it required a full experiment with a few people for a long period. It seems remarkable and, indeed, shameful that no suitable area could be found within the vast range of the British Empire, but His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom is not in a position to dictate to the other empire governments, and the approaches to the latter have hitherto been unsuccessful, or they were unsuccessful at the time. Finally, the League of Nations evolved a scheme for Assyrian settlement in the Orontes Valley in Syria, known as the Garb Scheme. Contributions towards the financial cost of the scheme, which was to be £1,146,000 sterling, were allocated as follows. The Iraqi and British governments each voted £250,000 sterling, the French mandated territory of the Levant £380,000, and the League of Nations £86,000, making a total of £966,000, and leaving a balance of £180,000 to be found. It was towards the finding as much as possible of this last sum that the Archbishop of Canterbury launched the Assyrian Settlement National Appeal at a meeting in the Mansion House of March 31, 1936, at which the Lord Mayor presided, and His Grace the Archbishop, the Foreign Secretary Mr. Anthony Eden, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Mr. L.S. Emery spoke, supported by the French ambassador and others. The Garb scheme seemed likely to succeed until the French decided to relinquish the Assyrian mandate. This stopped it. There's always one, eh? But the preliminary arrangements to carry it out had been started, and some 8,500 Assyrians are now camped at that time on the Kabir River in Syria, the first stage of the move. And here's some pictures here. Several efforts were made to find homes for the Assyrians before the French decided to relinquish their mandate a scheme was devised to settle them in Syria. Some were actually moved. And about 8,500 were accommodated in villages or beehive houses on the Kabul River. Very hard to see, it's very old photo. So this writer states, he must close this article with the problem still unsolved. The Assyrians with whom we are concerned are now in 4 groups. 8,500 on the Syrian Kabul, about 17,000 in the Mosul and Erbil Liwas of Iraq, and some 1,500 with Levis at Baghdad. He is now omitting, of course, those in Persia and elsewhere. He's leaving them out. He's not including them. He will end with a question. What danger do we fear for these people now situated as they are? The answer is shortly this. They feared a repetition of the 1933 events. They are helpless and scattered. They are to a great extent inarticulate. Many of them are getting desperate. Round them are hostile peoples with all the means of modern warfare. One act by a few desperate men may bring aeroplanes and armoured cars against them, and for those in the open country the Assyrian problem may be solved indeed. Let us only hope that we may not see as one of the landmarks of history of these days the disappearance of this ancient Christian people. The scapegoat. That's the picture of the scapegoat. It's a young kid. Scapegoat. That's the goat. The old Jewish religion, etc. House of Israel, the Israelites, where this goat was sacrificed for the sins of the peoples. Okay, so that's the term, the scapegoat. You put your problems on somebody else, right? Use somebody else as an excuse. It's like a replacement, okay, for what you did. That's what a scapegoat is. Additional notes on this article from the Geographical magazine. Okay, we have part 2, the Assyrian Church of the East. We will continue that in part 2. We hope that you enjoyed the history of the Assyrians and what hell they went through. If you know Assyrians, appreciate them, be compassionate and kind to them, because they've been through a hell of a lot of evils over the centuries. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and if you enjoyed this history of the Assyrians, subscribe to our channel, the Ministry of the Real Truth, and give us a like. Add your comments below. We'll be interested in what native born Assyrians have to say in regards to these articles. We are very, very interested. So add your comments below this video and we'll get back to you on those as soon as possible. And then go share this with all your family, friends, neighbours, strangers, etc. And those you may know who are native born Assyrians.